I was 28, back home after a failed attempt at becoming a writer for a big city newspaper. My dreams of literary stardom were on hold while I helped my aging parents on their isolated farm. It wasn't glamorous, but it was peaceful. Surrounded by endless fields of corn, the closest neighbor was an older woman, a widow who kept to herself. Life was slow, and for the first time in a long time, that's exactly what I needed. The quiet allowed me to focus on writing. I'd work on the farm during the day, then retreat to my third-floor bedroom at night. My little sanctuary with its cozy, quiet, and a view of the moonlit cornfields stretching to the horizon. The farm provided an unexpected muse. About 2 weeks in, something strange began to happen. Just before sunset, a figure would appear at the far edge of the cornfield. Initially, I dismissed it as someone from the neighboring farm checking their crops. They weren't on our land, so it didn't seem like a big deal. But the figure was unnervingly still, like a scarecrow. I couldn't even tell if it was facing me. It gave me a creepy vibe, but I brushed it off. Still, I thought it would make a striking photograph, that solitary silhouette against the fiery sunset. Over the next few days, the figure started appearing closer each evening, always between different rows of corn, always inching closer to the house. Still silent, still motionless, but definitely closer. One evening, I watched intently. It finally moved, confirming it was a person, not a scarecrow. I tried to convince myself it was harmless, maybe the neighbor lady my mum mentioned. I hadn't seen her, but maybe she had a reason to be near our property. How much trouble could an old woman cause? Right, wrong. I told my parents about it. My mum, ever the optimist, thought it was the neighbor's son, whom she described as a bit of an oddball. An understatement, it turned out. They were unconcerned, told me to let it be. Then one evening, working late in the barn, I looked toward the field and my blood ran cold. The figure was no longer at the edge of the field. It was just beyond our property line, much closer than ever before. A cold chill ran down my spine. Feeling a mix of unease and frustration, I decided to confront whoever it was. I walked to the edge of the field and yelled, "Who's there?" The figure turned and bolted into the corn. I gave chase, but as I rounded the corner, I saw him literally dive into a row of corn, vanishing from sight. My heart pounded as I scanned the field, but he was gone. I wasn't about to search blindly through those dense stalks. Fear twisted in my gut. The next morning, I went to the neighbor's farm to clear things up. The old woman answered the door. I explained what had been happening, but she was completely baffled. She hadn't been out after dark in weeks due to her health. She could barely get around her own house. I asked about her son. He'd left home years ago, she said, and hadn't lived with her since. My skin crawled. This was a complete stranger lurking on our property. I rushed back, filled with dread, and told my parents. Mum suggested calling the police, but Dad thought it was a waste of time since nothing illegal had actually happened. He told me to stay awake and wake him if the person came back. For the next few days, nothing. Relief washed over me. Then, later that week, while I was in the barn, everything went black. The power cut out without warning. I fumbled for my flashlight, sprinted toward the house, and froze. I wanted to run inside, but something held me back. As I turned to check the breaker main, I heard it, a rustling in the cornfield. He was back, and he was on our property, just feet from me. I swept the flashlight beam across the field, trying to be quiet. More rustling, then movement. I pointed the light. There, just a few feet away, stood a man in overalls, staring at me with a menacing look. He held a rusty garden trowel in his hand. Terror seized me. I ran. He chased me. I sprinted into the cornfield, hoping to lose him. He was right behind me. I turned a corner and dove into a row of corn, hiding, heart pounding, trying to muffle my breathing. Seconds later, he ran past. I eventually made it back to the house and called the police, waking my parents. The police searched but found nothing. They did, however, find the source of the outage, a bucket of water dumped on the breaker main. The next day, we installed security measures. I even warned the neighbor to be careful. I stayed for another month, but nothing more happened. Leaving my parents alone on the farm with that memory hanging over us was agonizing, but I had to move on. They hired a farmhand, so I wasn't needed anymore. This remains the most bizarre and unsettling experience of my life. It's something I still think about, especially when the sun starts to set and the cornfields rustle in the wind. This happened when I was about 10, so some of the details are a little fuzzy, but I still remember the important parts vividly. It was a sweltering summer in rural Nebraska, the kind where the air hung thick and heavy. My parents both worked long hours, so I was pretty much on my own after school. I biked everywhere. It was my freedom. Our house was tucked away, past a seemingly endless cornfield that stretched as far as the eye could see. The route to and from school meant circling this giant green maze, a rule enforced by my parents, who worried I'd get lost. "Don't cut through the cornfield," was their constant refrain, a warning I usually heeded. I'd seen enough scary movies to know that cornfields were bad news. One afternoon, while biking home, disaster struck. My bike chain snapped, leaving me stranded. I tried everything, but that chain refused to cooperate. Walking home with my bike in tow, under the blazing Nebraska sun, felt like a cruel and unusual punishment. I didn't have a cell phone back then, no way to contact my parents. A car passed, but asking for a ride from a stranger was out of the question. My parents had drilled that into me too. Staring at the imposing wall of cornstalks, I weighed my options. The long, hot walk around the field or the forbidden shortcut. The memory of my parents' warning echoed in my mind, but the allure of a quick escape was too strong to resist. I pushed my bike into the narrow path between the towering stalks, hoping for a swift, uneventful journey. The air inside the field was stifling, the sunlight filtered and dim. An eerie silence pressed in on me, punctuated only by the rustle of the leaves in the occasional breeze. The cornstalks seemed to close in, their shadows stretching like long, spindly fingers. A growing unease prickled my skin. I glanced nervously over my shoulder, half expecting something to be lurking just behind me. It was probably just nerves, but the feeling intensified. Then I heard it, a faint rustling just off the path, moving parallel to me. I stopped, heart pounding. Maybe it was just the wind, I told myself, but the sound didn't match the gentle swaying of the stalks. The rustling stopped, then started again as I resumed walking, closer this time, more distinct. The hair on the back of my neck stood on end. Was it an animal? What kind of animal would make that slithering sound? I picked up the pace, pushing my bike faster, my breath catching in my throat. The rustling kept pace, a chilling reminder that I wasn't alone. After what felt like an eternity, the rustling faded. I let out a shaky breath, convinced I'd finally outrun whatever was following me. At the next intersection, I turned a corner, hoping to put more distance between myself and the unseen menace. And then I saw him. A man stood in the middle of the path, blocking my way. He wasn't a farmer, not someone who belonged there. His clothes were ragged and torn, his arms covered in long, deep scratches, like he'd been dragged through thorns. He just stared at me, his eyes unnerving in the dim light. Frozen in fear, I could barely breathe. Then, in a low, raspy voice, he asked, "Are you lost?" I didn't answer, couldn't answer. He took a step closer, offering to help me find my way home. My mind screamed at me to run, but my body was locked in place, a terrifying paralysis gripping me. He quickened his pace, hands outstretched. That's when my legs finally responded. I dropped my bike and ran, the man's chilling words echoing behind me, "I'll help you." He gave chase, yelling that he just wanted to help, but I didn't stop, couldn't stop. I could hear him crashing through the corn behind me, his voice growing closer. Desperate, I dove into a thicket of stalks, curling into a ball, squeezing my eyes shut. He passed close by, muttering, "I'll find him." I huddled there for what felt like hours, every muscle tense, every breath a prayer. Finally, convinced he was gone, I crawled out, retrieved my abandoned bike, and stumbled home, shaken to my core. My parents were frantic, relieved and terrified all at once. I told them everything. My mum was in tears. My dad looked ready to tear the cornfield apart, stalk by stalk. He searched for the man, but he was long gone. My bike was never found. We got a new one, but that didn't erase the memory of that terrifying encounter. A few weeks later, something happened that forced us to flee. Coming home from school one afternoon, there it was, sitting on our porch, my old bike, the one I'd abandoned in the cornfield, the one with the broken chain, the one the man had been holding. That was the final straw. My parents didn't feel safe anymore. We moved soon after. They rarely mention it now, but the memory of that day, the man in the cornfield, his chilling promise, is etched in my mind forever. Sometimes, I still see those long, dark scratches in my dreams. I recently moved to rural Iowa. I needed a change, a fresh start, someplace quiet. I landed a dead-end job, factory work. Nothing glamorous, but it pays the bills. Honestly, it's not so bad. I don't plan on staying forever, but for now, the peace and quiet suits me. The endless fields of corn, well, that's Iowa for you. I'm a city boy, so this rural life is definitely taking some getting used to, the isolation, the vast open spaces, but I'm slowly adjusting, finding a rhythm. About 6 months ago, I found a small rental house. Dirt cheap rent, couldn't pass it up. The house itself was tiny, barely enough room to swing a cat, but the property was surprisingly large. The backyard stretched out forever, felt like acres. I didn't know what to do with all that space. Beyond the yard was this huge cornfield. Went right up to my property line, just a rickety wooden fence separating us. I could practically touch the house and the fence at the same time. Needless to say, I didn't have any close neighbors. The closest house was a good half-mile down a dirt road. At first, the isolation was kind of unsettling, but it grew on me. Evenings, I'd find myself staring out at that cornfield, lost in thought, the wind rustling through the stalks. It was almost hypnotic. I probably would have stayed there longer if it weren't for what happened next. It was a blustery October night, the kind that makes you want to curl up in a warm bed. Me, I actually like that kind of weather. There's something about the crisp air, shoving my hands deep in my jacket pockets. I was outside on the back deck, smoking a cigarette, taking one last look around before heading in for the night, when I heard it. A scream, not some distant animal cry. This was different. Sharp, high-pitched, definitely human. Sounded like a kid, maybe a young boy coming from the cornfield. Without hesitation, I ran inside, grabbed my hunting rifle, old family heirloom, and headed back out. I had this overwhelming feeling, a gut instinct, that a child was in danger. I had to do something. As I ran toward the field, I heard it again, the scream, louder, this time, closer, more desperate. I stopped dead in my tracks, frantically scanning the dark rows of corn. Nothing, I yelled out, asking the kid to scream again, but only silence answered. Adrenaline surged through me. I jumped the fence, picked a row at random, and ran. My phone's flashlight, a pathetic beacon in the darkness. I kept yelling, hoping for a response, but nothing. The silence was deafening. Finally, I admitted I was in over my head. I called the police, explained what I'd heard, and went back to the house to wait. When they arrived, I insisted on helping them search. They agreed, thankfully. We searched for what felt like hours, calling out. But there was no sign of anyone. No footprints, no disturbance in the cornstalks, nothing. We gave up. The officers told me to call back if I heard anything else. Frustrated, I went back inside, wondering if it had all been some cruel prank. I mean, kids get bored out here. But the thought of someone doing that, faking a cry for help, it made me sick. I tried to convince myself it was nothing, but I couldn't shake the feeling. Little did I know, things were about to get a whole lot worse. I was upstairs getting ready for bed when I saw it. A faint orange glow in the distance, coming from the cornfield. A fire. Panic gripped me. I rushed to the window. My heart sank. I yelled, I cursed, a string of obscenities escaping my lips. I had to act fast. That fire, though small, would spread quickly with the wind. I sprinted downstairs, dialing 911, practically screaming into the phone. I grabbed the garden hose, turned it on, full blast, jumped the fence, and ran. I prayed the hose would reach. Soaked to the bone, I finally reached the flames. I knew I was the only hope the fire department would take too long. I sprayed, fighting desperately to contain the blaze. It was unbelievably lucky that it hadn't already spread more. Within minutes, the fire was out. I leaned down, gasping for air, trying to wrap my head around what was happening. Just as I started to catch my breath, I saw movement in the corner of my eye. I turned. My blood ran cold. Someone was in my upstairs bedroom window. They were inside my house. Dropping the hose, I sprinted back towards the house. I burst through the front door, into the kitchen. The scene that greeted me stopped me dead in my tracks. The room was trashed. Fridge and cabinets wide open, dishes smashed on the floor. It was chaos. Before I could process it, I heard the front door slam. I spun around, ran to the door, but they were gone. I rushed outside again, but there was no sign of them. I was exhausted, overwhelmed, the adrenaline giving way to a sickening dread. I didn't have the energy to chase after them. I thought I might pass out. Minutes later, the police and firefighters finally arrived. I told them everything. This time, they took it seriously. Attempted arson is a felony. More officers, even police dogs, arrived to conduct a thorough search, but they found nothing. Whoever it was had vanished. For weeks, I couldn't sleep. Every creak, every rustle in the night set me on edge. I slept with my rifle next to me until I could finally move out. The whole thing made no sense. But what haunts me most is that first scream. The thought that a child might have been in danger, so close, and I couldn't help. It makes me sick.